Tracey Martin from New Zealand First, welcome. Thank you that you could be here in place of the Right Honourable Winston Peters, who I understand is on a bus in the north campaigning with Shane Jones.
No.
No.
He's actually on a bus with Clayton Mitchell and Fletcher Tabato in Hokitika.
Hokitika, okay, other end. Tracey Martin left the paid workforce in 1995 to be a full-time at-home caregiver of her and Ben's 3 children. She was elected as New Zealand First List Member of Parliament based in Warkworth at the 2011 election, was a Deputy Leader for 4 years. She spent the majority of her pre-Parliament term on parent-based fundraising and volunteer committees for Helensville Play Centre, Maharangi Kindergarten, Warkworth Primary School and Maharangi College. She is a spokesperson for Broadcasting, Education, Women's Affairs and Communications and IT, and previously the Youth Affairs, amongst others. In her maiden speech, you quoted from 1 Corinthians 13, but you also said, do you remember your maiden speech?
Most of it.
As I close, I also challenge myself. There is another saying that goes, if you have not done enough to be criticised, then you have not done enough. My personal challenge is that by the time I leave this house, I hope to be highly criticised. Have you lived out that?
I haven't left the house yet.
But I'm sure you've been criticised.
I have been criticised. We've been criticised, yeah.
Can I put the same question that I put to Leighton Baker, in that you're really just the Winston, I'm the devil's advocate here, you're really just the Winston Peters party.
Yeah, people say that, but if it hadn't been for me, my mother and a whole gaggle of other people, Winston wouldn't have come back in 2011. So Leighton will tell you, it takes more than one person to run a political party with tens of thousands of members throughout New Zealand. There is no doubt that Winston Peters is one of the best political leaders in New Zealand currently, and has been for the last 25 years. But he would not exist without the mechanism and the people that support him every day.
Were you always a New Zealand First person?
I was, actually. I don't trust National Labour because I lived through the 1980s and the 1990s and saw what happened to my country. And so my mother had been involved in setting up New Zealand First in 1993. Prior to that, she'd actually supported Social Credit and Gary Knapp on the North Shore. So I supported my mother because that's what you do. So I put up hoardings, and I tell the story about how I had a black and white Dalmatian, and my mother said to me one day down at Orewa Beach when Winston was going to do a speech that when I say we don't change our spots, you have to run from there to there with the dog and do it fast. And that's what you do when you're a daughter of a person who's standing for an election.
We've got flights to catch, so we've got limited time, so I'm going to
Sure.
get straight into it. And I've provided the questions in advance because I think, we're keen to know where New Zealand First stands, because at the moment, they're polling very well. 12%, around that mark?
Depending on whose your poll is.
Yep.
The National Party's poll has us around 16.
So it's quite possible that New Zealand First is really going to dictate who the next government is, whether it's a Labour Greens government or a national government.
That's
So
my hope.
can we just cover some of the issues that we've been talking about today? Firstly, decriminalisation of marijuana. Where does New Zealand First stand on that?
First of all, it's got to be split into recreational and medicinal.
Yeah.
Dr. John's quite right. Where there's been an inquiry at the Select Committee, there is no evidence around medicinal. There's anecdotal evidence, but no scientific evidence. So New Zealand First is not opposed to legalising medicinal marijuana, but not marijuana for medicinal purposes. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So you can't grow your own and use it as medicinal purposes. But with regard to recreational marijuana, we believe that everybody should get a vote. That's a conversation for the New Zealand public and a binding referendum.
So you'll oppose the Greens, Julianne Genta's private members bill?
We're just having a conversation around that. It's really interesting. And so the caucus hasn't made a final decision. It's possible we might support it only to Select Committee, to actually hear from people like Dr. John and other people like that. But the caucus hasn't made a final decision at this time.
Euthanasia, decriminalisation of euthanasia. Winston Peters has always said he's undecided, and I think probably that's because the 2 previous bills came out, and was Michael Law's New Zealand First at the time? I can't remember.
No, there was Peter Brown actually
Peter
put
Brown
forward
was
a
New
death
Zealand
with
First,
dignity,
yeah.
and the New Zealand First caucus supported it to Select Committee because it was a colleague after the death of his wife, but it didn't go forward, and it would have been a major conscience vote. Right now, the New Zealand First position is again 121 temporarily empowered MPs should not make this decision. And I'm really pleased I was here for the for Sinead's, presentation. I cared for my father to his passing, and she made some really amazing statements that have helped to inform me better when I get one vote, just like I believe everybody else should get one vote.
So, you know, the inquiry, there's been 78% opposition to euthanasia, and yet the polls suggest that 75% support it. Why the difference?
Well, and I agree with what the panellists said, actually. It's the way you put a question, isn't it? It's the way you put a question, and it's the way you highlight certain cases, which are tragic cases. But then there are all the other cases, like my father, who passed away with us caring for him with the care of hospice at home, which took 3 weeks for him to pass away, bedridden. But he was loved and cared for, and we were supported. So those are if you ask the right questions, you'll get the answer that you want, I suppose, would be my statement.
Isn't that the criticism against referendum, therefore? Because it is a blunt instrument, it's one question. And
actually, I don't, and that's why what's happening with New Zealand First is we're actually looking at that binding referendum policy because of, and Leighton pointed it out, we'd previously had it citizens initiated, and there was a 75% vote of a parliament could overturn it. The legislation that is going to be placed in the statutes books needs to be put before the New Zealand public, not just a question that then politicians can take and manipulate into what they want to have happen. So let's take anti-smacking. I have a very clear view of what that piece of legislation should look like to take away the confusion that is going on at the moment. That should be placed in front of the New Zealand public. They should have 18 months to have a true and honest conversation about it, and then you vote on that piece of legislation. That should take away some of that steered by the question sort of thing.
do you think there could ever be safeguards in place for euthanasia that would satisfy you?
For me personally, I'm incredibly hesitant. So I'm not comfortable with the concept, for me personally, no. And how do we justify to young people when we say, don't take your own life, and then on another side we say, except in certain circumstances? So, you know what I mean? It's challenging.
So when you come up to the first reading, look, I know that politicians say, I'm going to put it through first reading because then we'll get it to a select committee and hear all the ideas. The contra-argument to that is, by getting it through first reading, in a way, it's a tick for it. And that's a danger as well, isn't it?
That is the conversation. That is definitely the conversation that we have constantly. So, for example, with marriage amendment, we had a really strong conversation at our caucus because we had opposing views. And at the end of the day, we abstained in the first reading, went out and talked to the people who had voted us into place and said, if we can't stop this or give it to you, the people, to vote on it, do you want us to vote against it? And that was what they told us to do. We've got a conference coming up in 2 weeks, and this will be one of those questions that we'll put to the people, the voters of New Zealand First, and actually say, do you want us to stop this at first reading, or try and stop it at first reading, or do you want us to send it to a select committee and hear from the people? What is it that they want us to do?
You've touched on the smacking law. 10 years on, the opposition still remains high. In 2014, the New Zealand First policy from Winston Peters was to repeal the law and that you would not enter any coalition agreement with a party that wishes to ignore the public's clearly stated view in a referendum on that issue. This year, in a speech at Waipu, Winston Peters said New Zealand First will repeal the anti-smacking law. But then, when we highlighted that speech and he was on News Talk ZB, he said this matter should go to a referendum with New Zealand people who are far more reliable and trustworthy on these matters rather than a bunch of temporarily empowered parliamentarians. Classic Winston talk.
Yeah. If you go back and have a look at the original piece of wording, you can't repeal back to the original section 59 because it says there, it talks about schoolmasters. We don't have schoolmasters anymore. So what I'm saying is, as a piece of legislation, you can't just go back to it. If you have a look at, and this is what I was trying to point out in my conversation, was if you have a look at the current legislation, there is a clarity around section 1 of what was put in under Sue Bradford. But then there is the subsection 2, which completely annihilates the logic of subsection 1. It's bad law. So Winston feels very strongly about this, that it, and he voted against it in the first instance. It hasn't stopped. There's 10 more children being beaten to death in the 10 years since this legislation has been passed than in the 10 years before it. So if that was the reason, and that was the reason Helen Clark gave us for this piece of legislation, it hasn't worked. But we can't just repeal. So, and also we really need to go back and have another conversation with the New Zealand public. We feel that there has been since 2014. Right. Has the mood changed?
So the policy is to hold a referendum on it, or yes. is it to acknowledge the previous referendum? It's to hold a new referendum, is it?
My understanding from the conversation of our caucus is to hold a binding referendum with a couple of other issues. So there would probably be, for us, it would probably be the euthanasia issue, would go to binding referendum, the anti-smacking legislation would go to the binding referendum, and probably the situation around marijuana. Now,
can you just tell us how, under the New Zealand First policy, a referendum is stripped? How does it come into being?
So we've moved away, we've been doing some work around that, and I'm going to have to say that Dennis O'Rourke will put out some policy closer to the time. The citizens-initiated referenda, we had issues around the numbers and the mechanisms by which that would all work, and the fact that there was the 75% overturn rule. What we're looking at now is a way to have a parliament-initiated referenda when the public gives the parliament. So it's not required, doesn't require the government of the day to support it. That the people can give the parliament a topic. The parliament then has a responsibility to hold a referenda, which would be binding, and the parliament has a responsibility to inform through unbiased information the 18 months discussion. So that's about as detailed as I can get for you at the moment, I'm afraid.
Based on experience of the anti-smacking law, it'll be hard to get anti-bias out of Parliament on an issue.
Well, it's the parliamentary service, so it's not the politicians. So the Parliament would run it, so it would be the parliamentary servants. Right? So that, you've got to take the politics out of the issue, because otherwise we're not getting, that's what happened, we get crazy conversations because people are making politics out of it. We need to have a conversation for the people without politicians trying to get votes off it.
The Conservative Party criticism is that there's a veto for Parliament, so it's not really binding.
Well, that's the bit, that's one of the pieces that we're working on, because you're right. I mean, Leighton's right. It's there at the moment in the policy, and that's why we're having a look at the policy overall.
You, well, as you said, the whole party, but you voted against the same-sex marriage bill. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you define marriage as one man, one woman?
It's I don't, to be perfectly frank, I don't think about it. So I don't have a definitive definition for me. I voted against that bill because I don't think the government should have anything to do with marriage. There's only one reason why a state involves itself in somebody's relationship, and that's property. And marriage to me was something that belonged to the churches and belonged to the people, and it didn't belong to the government. So I opposed that bill because I didn't think that the bill itself around marriage should have gone through.
Didn't the state involve itself in marriage because it had the best outcomes?
Okay. No, society created marriage because of the concept of bringing together people to support each other into a unit, into a supportive unit. Parliament didn't create marriage. I forget how many times it's mentioned in the Old Testament.
No, but the reason the state got involved in marriage was because they saw that the best outcomes for a child is where the two people that created the child are committed to each other to raising that child.
Well, that's not why the state's involved in marriage now. They're only tracking property. That's the only reason, and they consider children property. So, that's the only reason why the state wants to track anybody's relationship, is because they want to know if and when a relationship falls apart, who gets what. It's totally changed the reason why the state's involved in any way, shape or form.
I actually asked the Prime Minister this question this morning. Do you think there should be more state involvement or less state involvement in families?
I think there should be more state involvement in supporting families and less state involvement in telling families how to be families. Does that make sense?
Yeah. We thought you voted well on the marriage one, even if maybe we didn't quite understand the reason. But you voted against protection of conscience. So in other words, venues being able to have the right to say no to same-sex marriages and celebrants being able to say no. There's been examples of celebrants who are being refused.
Oh, you're talking about the supplementary order paper?
Yeah,
That was a supplementary order paper.
supplementary order papers, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So independent celebrants and
Sure.
organisations not able to refuse based on their own conscience. Do you think they should be protected?
We had the conversation around that supplementary order paper, and while many of us supported the concept of it, we were opposed to that piece of legislation going through that House at all. We had attempted to have conversations with Lewissa Wall to turn it into a referendum issue, a binding referendum issue. We put in a supplementary order paper around that. What the conversation was is you cannot support one part of something when you don't think it should be there at all. So that was where New Zealand First fell. We all opposed the supplementary order paper on the basis that the Parliament should not be discussing this, the people should be discussing this.
What about now? Do you think that organisations, celebrants should have the right to stick to their own conviction of what marriage is?
I think that if you have the right to choose to do something, then how do you deny somebody else the right not to do something? So, you can't have it both ways. If you want the right to choose to be able to do a particular action, you cannot deny another person the right to choose not to do something. So from that perspective, I believe that there is.
But the argument used is that, well, if you choose to be a marriage celebrant, you've got to marry whoever comes in front of you.
Well, that's somebody else's argument because it's not mine.
The porn inquiry, my understanding is that the party does support an expert panel?
Yeah, absolutely.
You think there's a big need out there?
I think there's huge need. I think there's a huge need.
What do you think the government role would be in that? That you have this discussion.
I know. It's around how do we control? Because, and ultimately, look, once upon a time, and we thought it was horrific, once upon a time when we had Playboy and Hustler, do you remember all that? And now, of course, it's coming at from every direction. I was talking to a young lady here from your audience just about music videos. How do we have to get to the situation where the censor has to go through every music video and start to rate music videos, and music videos over a certain rating have to be on a pay-per-view channel? It's coming at our children from every perspective. So part of an inquiry, I know the inquiry is about isolating and identifying the harm, but alongside that, we've got to have, how can we control it? How are we going to actually, in this digital age, manage what's being directed at our children? And I don't have an answer to that. I truly don't.
New Zealand First supports an independent watchdog for child, youth and family, or the new Ministry of Vulnerable Children.
Yes.
The Prime Minister tried to suggest that there were already independent watchdogs sort of built into the ministry under the current legislation.
And I mean, the number of people coming into my office who are having to deal with oranga tamariki, which was, SIFs, and the cases, the lack of care. And I'm going to say that's because the whole service is underfunded, under-resourced, and the attitude is wrong. The attitude that the social workers have been told to take is wrong.
Just in terms of taxation of families, actually, can I just cover the parental notification? New Zealand First and the Maori Party were the only parties to support Hillary Keefe's petition for parental notification.
Yeah.
Has there been any discussion about the possibility of a private member's bill on that, pushing that issue further?
Not at this stage, not inside this caucus. Everybody's got a bill in their ballot at the moment. There was only one piece around that petition, and the reason why everybody else sort of took that space was they wanted to make sure that there would be, if there was parental notification, there would be no harm for the young person. And our view was that you can put in safeguards around that. But at this stage, no, nobody's put in a member's bill at this stage on that.
We talked about the economics of the family with the Prime Minister this morning, and just looking at Winston's voting record, my understanding is that the party and he supports income splitting for parents. Is that correct?
Yes.
Supports paid parental leave being raised to 6 months?
Yes, and actually, can I tell you about that? So I just put a policy on the table a few weeks ago around paid parental leave, and it was kind of built off a submission that your organisation put forward. I've been working for most of my life to try and make women equal in the workforce, and I decided I'd try a different tact and actually try to make men equal at home. So what we did was, we've approved a policy that we will extend paid parental leave to 26 weeks. 4 weeks will be tagged for mothers and cannot be transferred. 4 weeks will be tagged for fathers and cannot be transferred. And then the bit in the middle, either parent can take. And we hope by this that we'll actually be able to incentivise and give social permission for fathers to be able to stay at home, care for their 6-month-old babies and connect with the family.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's an official policy announcement
It's an
at the Family
official
First
policy
Forum.
announcement, yeah.
Fathers need to be more involved and more help them be more
Fairer
involved.
for fathers is what we're calling it, yeah.
Well, it's fairer for mothers as well, isn't
I
it?
agree.
Because they're going through the whole
And
having had a baby and need the support.
That's right, but also, dads will get an idea about actually how hard it is to be at home and sometimes be isolated with a small child. So, and then that helps to create that empathy inside the relationship that creates a stronger relationship where people understand each other and how their roles are and how they need to support each other.
There's, you would have heard just in our discussion, there's a very strong push to decriminalise abortion. It's not a legal issue, it's a health issue. Where does New Zealand First stand on that?
I kind of disagree with the young lady that talked about why it's in the Crimes Act. The reason I believe it's in the Crimes Act is we once upon a time had a situation where abortions were taking place on the kitchen table. And women died. My grandmother, my mother's mother and her sister both died of backstreet abortions down in Christchurch during the war. So one of the reasons why it's in the Crimes Act is to give the capacity for a woman who requires it to gain a termination of a pregnancy, but it must not be done in the way that it was done previously. It must be done in a controlled environment. So for me, it has to stay in the Crimes Act because to do it in any other way than what is dictated is a crime.
So it's actually about protecting the woman.
It's protecting the woman, yeah. And you know that our policy is safe, rare and legal. And for us, it's not rare enough. So I'm also working on other policies around with the family planning clinics and so on and so forth about expanding the opportunity for sexual and reproductive health, contraceptives and other ways that women can take more control or hopefully gain more control and not find themselves in a situation where they seek that service. We'd like to see it be rarer.
Closing down family planning clinics would be the best option, wouldn't it?
Well, we don't see it that way.
Because
There's too many young women who cannot afford to go to the doctor in this country. And there's in the whole of the north, there's one family clinic in Whangarei. How many teen mothers have we got up in the north? How many children are being not cared for to the best of their ability up in the north? And from that perspective, we would prefer to see women have greater options before they find themselves needing to use that service.
And some people could argue that that's because of declining marriage rates and poor formation of families and breakdown of families.
Some people could argue that.
Would you like some evidence?
It's okay. That's okay, Bob. I'm not, that's okay. But I'm just explaining to you New Zealand First position.
Well, actually, just based on that, some people are arguing, based on 38 states in the US and a number of other countries, about informed consent. In other words, part of the criticism against family planning is that they're not telling women the whole story, the alternatives, the options of adoption, the risks of abortion. Do you think there's a place for more stringent requirements? And also against coercion, the boyfriend putting the pressure on the girl to have the abortion, the easy fix?
First of all, I'd like to see evidence. So I'd like to see evidence that is what family planning is doing. So we would need to actually have people who would go on affidavit and do those sort of things, that is what they found to be true. And then you'd have to deal with it from that perspective. With regard to coercion, then that again comes back down to where can these young women go that they can feel safe. And I do actually also pick up on what your other speaker said. I'm a strong feminist as well, and there's a whole lot of roles around men inside of this thing that need to be addressed.
You opposed Easter trading laws?
Yes. We opposed Easter trading laws because we believed that each community needed to make that decision for themselves.
But that's what the law was that was in front of Parliament, was empowering local councils to make the decision.
That's local councils. That's not a referendum of the people that live in that area. So we opposed that because it didn't require the council to have a referendum. The council themselves could just make the decision.
Okay. So one of the arguments, once again, devil's advocate, is that New Zealand First is very reliant on referendums, and that's a good thing because that's democracy, but actually, why do we need Parliament? Let's just run the country by referendum.
Well, there's a whole lot of stuff that Parliament does that isn't just there's a whole lot of laws and bits and pieces that we go through and do that I'm quite sure that everybody here doesn't want to do on a daily basis, trade agreements, all sorts of things like that. So you can't put all of those things down to referendum. And you raised the thing about having a referendum about tax, and Proposition 13 from California keeps getting risen whenever we raise the binding referendum conversation. But there is something to be said, and we have a policy of let's lower the number of members of parliament. Let's spread some of that decision-making out. But you still do need a Minister of Education, a Minister of, a Minister of, a Minister of. So you still, and you need an opposition to challenge those people to make sure that you have an open and transparent parliament.
If New Zealand First is part of government, what minister would you like to be?
We try to avoid those questions.
Do you? Well, you can tell us because Winston's not here. We won't tell anyone.
Right. My first choice would be education, because we've got the best education policy across the whole of the compulsory and tertiary sector of any political party out there. I know because I wrote it. And it's 8 documents, so I can send them to you. If, however, I'm not going to take responsibility for somebody else's stuff up by being a token Minister of Education for somebody else. So if I couldn't be that, it would be the Minister for Women.
Could you just, will you have a minister for men in your party?
Now, I could give you Paula Bennett's answer, which is that on the day that women aren't overly represented in domestic violence numbers and when women are paid equally, then we will abolish the Ministry for Women.
The Bible in schools, do you think there's a place for Bible in schools?
Yeah.
If the school wants it and the parents want it?
Well, it's about every 3 years that when I was on the board of trustees, this was my understanding of the law. Every 3 years you had to survey your community, and if your community wanted to have Bible in schools, then the school shut down for a half-hour period to actually deliver Bible in schools. I believe that's the right of the school community. I don't think boards are being professionally developed enough to realise that's their responsibility. So why would I take away what is the opportunity again of a local community to decide what they want to have, and the school is technically shut. So it's not during school hours, they're shut.
Would it be fair to say that New Zealand First, on the whole, from what I understand of the MPs and from Winston, is that the Judeo-Christian values, the history, the culture of New Zealand is quite strong in the party?
Yeah. I mean, this is New Zealand. We're based on a series of, as you say, values, and the base laws are based on the commandments. So that's what our society is built on. That's the solid foundation of it, and that's what we stand for.
Do you think Family First should still be a charity?
I do, actually.
Thank you.
I do. And I tell you why. Because you have to have balance. When something is out of balance, it will go badly. And you are required to be the voice over here, to balance the voice that's over here. Right? So I do. I think you have a place, and I think the question should be, somebody should ask whether sanitarium should still be a charity.
Well, we won't go there, because I like Weet-Bix. But anyway, we are out of time, and you came at very short notice. You were thrown in the deep end, but we appreciate you being here. So please, Tracey Martin, let's give her a thank you very much.
I'll shoot off.
Thank you.